The ballroom of the Hargrove Grand Hotel smelled like money and fresh flowers, the kind of place where everything gleamed just a little too perfectly, where the champagne was already being poured before the guests had even found their seats. It was the kind of evening that people in Atlanta would talk about for years. Not because of the wedding itself, but because of what happened when the doors opened at exactly 7:30. But to understand why that moment shattered everything, you have to go back 3 years. Loretta Ashford had spent 11 years building a life she thought was solid. 11 years of early mornings and quiet sacrifices, of skipping the girls' trips and the impulse buys, of working double shifts at the hospital administration office so that her husband could pursue the architecture firm he always said would change everything. She had believed him. That was the thing people never quite understood. She hadn't been naive, hadn't been blind. She had believed in Colin Ashford the way you believe in something you helped build with your own hands. Their daughter, Lily, was 4 when Loretta found the texts. She hadn't been snooping. Colin had left his phone on the kitchen count face-up, and the screen had lit with a message that made her stomach drop before she'd even finished reading it. 3 words, and a name she didn't recognize. Simone, just miss you already. She could have confronted him right then. Instead, she stood in the kitchen for a long time, holding a dish towel, listening to Lily laugh at something on the television in the next room. The confrontation came 2 days later, after Loretta had gathered herself enough to speak without her voice breaking. Colin hadn't denied it, he'd said, and she would never forget the way he said it, almost tired, like she was the inconvenient part. That he and Simone had been together for over a year. That what he felt for Simone was something Loretta had never made room for. That he thought it was better to be honest. Better to be honest. After a year. The divorce was quiet and ugly in the way that divorces with children always are. Ugly not in screaming or thrown dishes, but in spreadsheets and custody calendars, and the particular silence that falls over a house when one person has already left it emotionally long before they leave physically. Colin moved out in March. By April, Loretta had learned she was pregnant. She sat in her car in the hospital parking garage for 40 minutes, before she could make herself go back inside to finish her shift. A second child. A man who had already emotionally vacated the marriage. A 4-year-old who still asked every morning if Daddy was coming home for dinner. She called her sister that night and cried so hard she could barely get the words out. Her sister, Patricia, drove 4 hours from Nashville and stayed for 2 weeks. And those 2 weeks were the reason Loretta didn't completely come apart. The pregnancy was hard. The divorce proceedings were harder. Colin's attorney was aggressive in a way that felt personal, and Loretta's attorney kept reminding her to stay focused on outcomes, not emotions, which was the least helpful advice she had ever received. In the end, she kept the house, barely, and negotiated shared custody of Lily. The court ordered Colin to pay child support for Lily and, once he was born, for Owen as well. He paid, sometimes on time, sometimes 3 weeks late with no explanation. Owen was born in November, small and loud and absolutely perfect, in a way that broke Loretta's heart and repaired it simultaneously. She held him in the hospital room, with Lily pressed against her side, asking if the baby was done cooking yet, and for a few minutes, everything else fell away. Then the bills came due again. The years that followed were not the kind of years that make for good storytelling. They were the kind that are just hard, relentlessly, unglamorously hard. She negotiated a better position at the hospital, became a department coordinator, took on a certification program on nights and weekends, while Patricia watched the kids over video call. She drove a car with a cracked dashboard and ate lunch at her desk most days, and told herself that this was temporary, that she was building toward something, even when she couldn't quite see what that something was. Colin, meanwhile, was doing very well. The architecture firm had taken off in the way he had always predicted it would, and he moved into a downtown loft and started appearing in the kind of Atlanta social pages that Loretta had never paid attention to before and now could not stop noticing. He and Simone were photographed at charity galas, at restaurant openings, at a rooftop birthday party for someone Loretta had never heard of. Simone was 29, slender, and worked in commercial real estate. She wore clothes that looked expensive in a way that was designed to look effortless. Loretta was not on social media much, but people told her things anyway. A former coworker sent a screenshot without warning. A neighbor mentioned she'd seen the couple at brunch. These little dispatches arrived regularly, unsolicited, wrapped in a sympathy that sometimes felt more like entertainment. The moment things shifted, quietly, privately, without fanfare, came on a Tuesday in February, when Loretta's supervisor introduced her to the new board consultant who had been brought in to restructure the hospital's administrative systems. His name was Graham Sutton, and he was 52 years old, recently widowed, with the particular quality of someone who had experienced enough of life to move through it without performance. They did not fall in love immediately. That is not how it happened. What happened was that Graham Sutton asked her a question about a workflow process she had flagged in a report, and she answered it in full because no one had ever actually asked her that before. And he listened. Actually listened, and then said, "That's exactly right. Why hasn't anyone acted on this?" She didn't know what to say to that. She was used to being the person who noticed things and then waited for someone else to do something about them. Over the following months, Graham came back to Atlanta 4 more times for the project. They had lunch twice, dinner once, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Loretta realized she had started looking forward to those visits in a way she hadn't looked forward to much of anything in years. He was not rushing her. That was the thing that undid her, a little. He was patient in a way that was deliberate but never patronizing, and when she finally told him on a rainy Thursday evening about Colin and the divorce and Owen being born without his father in the waiting room, Graham didn't offer condolences or solutions. He just said, "You built something real out of that." And somehow that was exactly the right thing. By the following autumn, they were together. Not loudly, Loretta was not interested in loudness, but consistently and with a seriousness that she hadn't expected to find again. She did not broadcast it. She told Patricia and her closest friend Adrian, and eventually, carefully, Lily. Owen was too young to understand what Mom's friend Graham meant, but he accepted Graham's presence with the cheerful pragmatism of a 3-year-old who had decided Graham was good, because Graham had once bought him a blue toy truck. She did not post about it online. She did not mention it to Colin. So when the invitation arrived, she had no way of knowing what Colin knew or didn't know about her life in the past year. The envelope was thick cream paper with a gold-embossed return address and her name written in calligraphy. It was a wedding invitation, Colin Ashford and Simone Delacroix, requesting her presence at their celebration on the 14th of December at the Hargrove Grand Hotel, Atlanta, Georgia. Black tie. 7 o'clock. Loretta stood at the kitchen counter and read it twice. Then she set it down and went to pour herself a glass of water. She called Patricia that night, and Patricia's response was immediate and vivid. "Absolutely not. Delete it. Throw it in the trash. Who invites their ex-wife to their wedding? Who does that?" Loretta's friend Adrian had a different theory. "He wants you to see it. He wants you to show up looking like you've been struggling, and he wants Simone to see it too. It's a power move, Loretta. Don't go." Loretta thought about it for 2 weeks. She thought about it at her desk during Lily's soccer practice, during the long quiet after the kids were in bed. She thought about Colin's face when he'd told her he was being honest, and the way he'd looked at her at the last custody exchange. A flicker of something that might have been satisfaction, might have been relief at seeing her in her practical coat with her sensible tote bag and her tired eyes. She thought, "He thinks he knows what I look like right now." Graham, when she finally told him about the invitation, was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you want to go?" "I don't know," she said, which was honest. "Because if you want to go," he said, "then we go." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "It's his wedding. I'm aware it would be a statement." Graham Sutton looked at her with the calm of a man who had navigated enough complicated situations in his life to be unbothered by one more. "You're not making a statement," he said. "You're attending an event you were invited to. What other people make of that is their business." She called the number on the response card the next morning and confirmed. 2 guests. She did not mention Graham by name. In the weeks that followed, she did not overthink it. She found a dress, a deep jewel green that Adrian called devastating, and made an appointment to have her hair done, and arranged for Patricia to come down from Nashville to be with Lily and Owen for the evening. She was not doing this for revenge. She had told herself that clearly, had interrogated her own motives the way she interrogated everything. She was doing this because she had spent 3 years allowing Colin Ashford to define her story in her own absence, and she was tired of it. The evening of the 14th was cold and clear, the kind of December night where the air has a particular quality that makes city lights look sharper. Graham arrived at her door in a tuxedo, holding a small box with a bracelet she had admired once, months ago, in passing. She hadn't remembered mentioning it. Apparently he had. His car was a black Mercedes, not the limousine that the story, in other hands, might have demanded. He had offered to arrange something more and she had said no. She wasn't trying to be theatrical. She was just trying to show up. They arrived at the Hargrove Grand at 7:20. The valet took the car without expression. The lobby smelled of white roses and heated air. Loretta Ashford walked into the ballroom of the Hargrove Grand Hotel in a jewel green gown with her shoulders back, her hand resting in the crook of Graham Sutton's arm. The room was already full, 200 guests, maybe more, glittering beneath the chandeliers, glasses raised, voices in that particular register of performative delight that expensive events produce. The reaction was not immediate. These things never are. It started at the edge of the room, with a woman Loretta vaguely recognized as one of Colin's college friends, who turned from her conversation and went very still. Then a murmur, and a shift, the way water moves when something is dropped into it. She recognized some of them, former colleagues of Colin's, neighbors from the house they used to share. 2 people from the firm, all of them watching her with that particular expression, recalibrating, reassessing, updating the version of Loretta they had filed away. She had been filed away as the ex-wife, the one left behind, the one who stayed home while Colin moved forward. She felt Graham's hand cover hers briefly. She did not look at him. Colin saw her from across the room. She watched him see her. The precise moment when his eyes found her face, traveled to Graham, came back to her dress, went to Graham again. Something passed through his expression that she could not quite name but recognized. It was the look of a man whose private satisfactions had just become significantly more complicated. He came toward them, and she felt the gathering attention of the room without looking for it. "Loretta," he said. His voice was very even. "You came. You invited me," she said pleasantly. His eyes moved to Graham again. "Waiting," she said. "Colin, this is Graham Sutton." Graham extended his hand. "Congratulations," he said, with the effortless warmth of someone who genuinely meant it and genuinely didn't need anything from the moment. "You have a beautiful venue." Colin shook the hand. His grip was probably too firm. "Graham," he said, "how do you 2 know each other?" "We met at the hospital," Loretta said. A pause. "You're a doctor?" "No," Graham said without elaboration. The pause stretched. Colin was a man who was very good in rooms, who knew how to read social situations, who had always prided himself on being the most composed person in a conversation. Loretta had watched that composure carry him through 100 client dinners and professional negotiations. It was slipping slightly now, in a way that was invisible to most people in the room but visible to her, because she had spent 11 years reading his face. Simone appeared at Colin's elbow, white gown, perfect posture, exactly as beautiful and assembled as Loretta had seen in all those photographs. She looked at Loretta with the careful blankness of someone who had prepared for this and was now discovering that preparation was insufficient. "Simone," Loretta said warmly. "You look stunning." "Congratulations," Simone said. "Thank you." Her eyes went to Graham and stayed there a second too long. Someone called Colin's name from across the room and the moment dissolved, as moments at parties always do. Everyone moving back into the current of the evening, the music picking back up, glasses being refilled. Loretta and Graham moved to their table, which was, she noticed with a private amusement, quite far from the head table. She had expected that. Adrian had offered to come as a kind of reconnaissance support. Loretta had declined. She didn't need witnesses. She didn't need someone to report back. She just needed to be present. Dinner was served. The food was excellent. Graham was easy company in the way that he always was, and they talked about Lily's soccer and Owen's current fixation with outer space, and a book Graham was reading about post-war architecture, and Loretta felt, with some surprise, almost relaxed. The toasts came after dinner. Colin's best man gave one that was funny and sentimental, and carefully avoided any reference to previous marriages. Simone's friend gave one that mentioned how long Simone had waited for the right person at the right time, which produced a particular charged silence among certain guests before the applause resumed. Then Colin stood, glass in hand, and looked out at the room. She had not expected him to speak directly to her. She had thought he might ignore her presence or manage it, the way he managed everything, from a careful distance. Instead, he made an error. It was small, and it was telling, and it came from the same place that had produced the invitation in the first place, his absolute certainty about how things were supposed to go. He said, with a smile that was meant to be gracious but was calibrated to land differently, "I want to acknowledge everyone here tonight, even those who might have had reservations about coming." He looked at her when he said it. "It means a great deal." The room went briefly uncertain. A few people looked at Loretta. A few people looked at Colin. Graham set down his fork. Loretta picked up her champagne glass and held it without drinking. The moment passed, buried under applause and music and the general forward motion of the evening. But it had happened, and people had felt it, and the story that had traveled through the room all evening. "That's his ex-wife. Can you believe he invited her? And who is that man she's with?" Now had a new chapter, and the chapter was. And then he pointed at her in front of everyone, and she didn't flinch. She didn't flinch. She sat with her back straight, and her expression pleasant, and her champagne glass untouched, and let the moment settle around her like water finding its level. Later, near 10 o'clock, a woman found her near the bar. Early 60s, silver hair, the kind of forthright warmth that doesn't apologize for itself. Loretta didn't know her. "I'm Louise," the woman said. "I'm Colin's aunt. I want you to know that I thought the invitation was wrong. I told him so. And I want you to know that you've handled this evening with more dignity than it deserved." Loretta looked at her. "Thank you. That man you're with," Louise said, with a frank curiosity that reminded Loretta of Patricia. "He seems like a good one." "He is," Loretta said. And then, because it was true and she felt like saying true things, "It took me a while to believe that." Louise nodded once like she understood exactly what that meant and moved back into the crowd. They left at 10:30, not early enough to seem rattled, not late enough to seem like they were proving something. Graham helped her with her coat at the valet stand and didn't ask how she was feeling until they were in the car, moving through the city lights. "How are you feeling?" he said. She thought about it. "Like I did something I needed to do." He nodded. "Did you have a terrible time?" she asked. "No," he said. "The lamb was very good." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed all evening, and it was real, and it felt like something releasing. The story that spread through Atlanta's social circles in the weeks following the wedding was a particular kind of story. The kind that people tell at dinners and in text message threads, the kind that gets slightly more dramatic with each retelling. In its most condensed form, Colin Ashford had invited his ex-wife to his wedding in order to display her diminished circumstances, and she had arrived on the arm of Graham Sutton. Graham Sutton, who, this was the part that people discovered gradually, and which made the story better with every discovery, was the founder of Sutton Capital Partners, one of Atlanta's most significant private equity firms, who had the previous year underwritten a major expansion of the very hospital system where Loretta worked, who was, as one of Colin's business associates put it to another at their club, exactly the kind of man that Colin has been trying to get a meeting with for 3 years. Colin had known none of this. Loretta had not told him. She had not told anyone outside her immediate circle, because she was a private person and Graham was a private person, and their relationship belonged to them, not to a social narrative. But the discovery traveled, as discoveries do, and with it came a recalibration of the story Colin had told himself, and others about the divorce, about Loretta, about who had ended up where. Simone, 3 weeks after the wedding, asked Colin why he had invited Loretta. He told her it had been a gesture of civility. She looked at him for a long moment and said nothing. She would ask again differently 6 months later. But that is a different story. The story that mattered was quieter than any of this. It happened on a Saturday morning in January, when Loretta was making pancakes, and Owen was explaining a documentary about Saturn he had half-watched the night before, and Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table with her headphones around her neck, and Graham came in from the back porch where he'd been on a call and poured himself coffee. and the four of them existed in the kitchen together with the particular ease of people who have decided, collectively and without ceremony, that this is where they belong. Lily looked up from her homework and said, "Graham, can you explain fractions?" "Mom explains them in a way I don't understand," Graham said. "Your mom probably explains them correctly, but I'll try." Loretta kept her eyes on the pancakes. She had not expected this. Not the man, not the quiet Saturday, not the feeling of standing in her own kitchen with her children and someone who chose to be there, chose it deliberately, without being asked, without needing anything from the choice. She had spent a long time bracing for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the version of events where this too was taken from her. The shoe didn't drop. What happened instead was ordinary and irreplaceable. Owen asked if Saturn had more moons than Jupiter, and Graham said he wasn't sure, and they looked it up together on Owen's tablet, and it turned out Jupiter had more. And Owen was personally offended on Saturn's behalf, and Lily laughed without looking up from her fractions, and the pancakes were done. Loretta Ashford had spent 11 years building a life she thought was solid, and it had turned out not to be. Not because she had built it wrong, but because she had built it with someone who wasn't interested in keeping it. She had spent 3 years after that building a different life, alone and without a blueprint, in the gaps between work and children and exhaustion. This was what she had built. It wasn't the story anyone had expected. Not Colin, who had expected her to arrive at his wedding diminished. Not the guests, who had expected drama or tears, or some kind of satisfying confrontation. Not even Loretta herself, who had walked into the Hargrove Grand Hotel braced for something, and come out the other side of it feeling, unexpectedly, finished. Not finished as in over. Finished as in complete. She stood at the stove on that Saturday morning and listened to Owen argue earnestly with Graham about planetary moon counts. And she thought, this is what I stayed standing for. This is the thing I was building toward, even when I couldn't see it. The pancakes were good. The coffee was hot. The light through the kitchen window was the particular gold of a January morning. The kind that doesn't last, but is beautiful for exactly as long as it does. She wasn't waiting for anything anymore.